One of the most important aspects of shooting great photographs is getting the exposure right. Even though you might be able to use a computer to try and compensate for bad exposure, there's just no substitute for getting it right in the first place. Now, as I said at the beginning of the program, the purpose of this DVD is to teach you about the specific controls, functions, and features of the Nikon D5000. So we're not going to get sidetracked into discussing the general principles of exposure that would apply to every SLR. If you want to learn more about shutter speed, aperture, ISO, metering, and how they interact to affect the camera's exposure, I suggest you watch the Magic Lantern DVD called Great Photos with Your Digital SLR. As I've mentioned a couple of times already, there are 13 different settings on the exposure mode dial, which can be divided into two parts, the advanced modes and the point and shoot modes. Depending on the mode you have chosen, sometimes you'll be in complete control of the shutter speed, aperture, ISO, and metering mode, but sometimes you'll only have partial control. The 9 point and shoot modes are fully automatic, automatic with the flash off, scene, portrait, landscape, child, sports, close-up, and night portrait. Let's spin the dial back to scene and take a closer look at that one, because it's different than the others. When the mode dial is set on this position, you can pick from another 13 types of exposure modes by turning the command dial. There's night landscape, party indoor, beach snow, sunset, dusk dawn, pet portrait, candlelight, blossom, autumn colors, food, silhouette, high key for shooting objects on light backgrounds, and low key for shooting objects on dark backgrounds. So that makes a total of about 21 different point and shoot modes. But what you need to understand is that all of the point and shoot modes are really just different variations of putting the camera on automatic exposure for taking snapshots. So if you really don't want to be bothered with setting any of the camera's controls yourself, then just turn the dial to one of the point and shoot modes and start shooting. But I encourage you to think twice before using any of the point and shoot modes. Why? Because they take too much control out of your hands and give it to the camera. Not only do they take charge of the exposure settings, they also override just about every other custom setting on the camera, including white balance, active D-lighting, picture control, the flash, the metering mode, and more. My advice is to learn to shoot like a professional and use the advanced modes instead, because they give you a lot more control over the camera's settings. Yes, there may be a bit of a learning curve as you figure out how the camera works and which settings are best to use in different situations, but in the long run, you'll be rewarded with much better results. The advanced modes are program auto exposure, shutter priority, aperture priority, and manual. These are the professional modes and are the only ones that allow you to take full advantage of the power and flexibility that the D5000 offers. The question is, which of the 4 advanced modes should you use at any given time? Well, that depends on what you're shooting. Programmed auto can sometimes be selected if you're new to photography, or for times when you don't want to be bothered tinkering with the camera's settings. In this mode, the D5000 will do most of the thinking for you. But unlike the point and shoot exposure modes, you'll still be able to control the white balance, the metering mode, the focus mode, and other settings yourself. Shutter priority can be the best choice if controlling the shutter speed is important. In this mode, you set the shutter speed and the camera adjusts the aperture to produce the optimal exposure. For example, you'd want to set a fast shutter speed, over 1/1000th of a second, for sports, and a slow shutter speed, under 1 second, for special effects like this. Aperture priority can be the best choice if controlling depth of field is important. In this mode, you set the aperture and the camera adjusts the shutter speed to produce the best exposure. For example, you'd probably want a small aperture, such as f/22, for landscape shooting, so that everything is in focus, and a large aperture, such as f/2.8, for shooting a portrait, so that you can limit the depth of field and thus keep the background out of focus. Manual exposure mode can be the best choice if you have a good understanding of photography and you want maximum flexibility. In this mode, you control both the shutter speed and the aperture. But for routine normal shooting, I think most photographers would agree that manual takes a lot more work than it's worth. I'd have to say that I probably shoot with either aperture priority or shutter priority mode 99% of the time. For the rest of this chapter, I'm going to use aperture priority. The second part of controlling exposure is to decide which method of metering you want the camera to use. Metering is how the camera analyzes the intensity of the light within the scene you're shooting and then calculates what the proper exposure should be just before the shutter snaps. The camera's goal is to find a certain combination of shutter speed and aperture that will result in a perfect exposure. To set the metering mode, press the I button and go to the metering icon. There are 3 metering mode choices: matrix, center weighted, and spot metering. Spot metering only measures the light at the center of the frame and ignores everything else in the picture. Sometimes this can be a good choice when your main subject is situated in front of a background that is a lot brighter or darker. Center weighted measures the light intensity from all over the frame, but assigns the greatest importance to the center area when it decides what the best exposure should be. Matrix is the mode I recommend that you trust for just about everything you shoot. It's the most sophisticated mode for the camera's metering system because it measures the light intensity from over 1,000 points in the scene and employs complex algorithms for better evaluation of highlights, shadows, and even faces. For routine shooting, just leave the metering on matrix and you'll be fine. So let's review. We've selected aperture priority as our exposure mode and matrix as the metering mode. That's probably the combination I use most often, and I could start shooting right now with confidence that most of my shots are going to be properly exposed. However, although the D5000 is a sophisticated camera, it's just a machine. It doesn't know what you're actually taking a picture of, and it can't really know which settings are going to be the best in all situations. It's up to you, as the photographer, to keep your eye on the exposure and then to fine-tune the camera as necessary. The D5000's exposure compensation function is by far the easiest way to manipulate the camera's exposure settings when you want to override them without having to switch to the manual exposure mode. First, aim the camera at the subject and observe the exposure settings. This f-stop and this shutter speed are what the camera thinks are the best settings. But let's say that, for whatever reason, you disagree. Maybe you already took one picture and it looked too bright or too dark, and so now you want to override the settings that the camera has chosen, either by increasing the exposure to let more light into the camera or by decreasing the exposure by letting less light into the camera. This is called exposure compensation. One way to activate exposure compensation is to hold down the exposure compensation button and then turn the main command dial. Another way of doing it is to press the I button, navigate to the exposure compensation setting, and then change it by pressing the up or down arrow buttons. To increase the exposure, change this setting to a positive number. Or to decrease the exposure, change this setting to a negative number. The range goes from +5 to -5. Be aware, though, that your exposure compensation setting stays in effect until you decide to change it again, Even if you turn off the camera and turn it back on, exposure compensation will still be active. We've talked a lot about shutter speed at aperture, so now it's time to take a closer look at ISO. ISO is a measurement of how sensitive the camera is to light. When you use a higher ISO, you are electronically amplifying the signal that is being generated by the image sensor. And the more the signal is amplified, the lower the picture quality will be. ISO can be set on the D5000 by pressing the I button, navigating to the ISO setting, and pressing the OK button. ISO sensitivity can be set between 200 and 3200. For special situations, ISO sensitivity can even be raised above 3200 to high 0.3, which equals ISO 4000, high 0.7, which equals ISO 5000, and high 1, which equals ISO 6400. At the other end of the scale, you can select an ISO below 200. Low 0.3 equals about ISO 160. Low 0.7 equals about ISO 125, and low 1.0 equals an ISO of about 100. On the D5000, ISO 200 ought to be your normal setting, and you should only raise it when absolutely necessary.